Before that night, I had learned to move through rooms like this without leaving ripples. I was in my early 60s, the age where people stopped asking what you did and started assuming you were finished doing it. I didn't correct them. I had spent most of my adult life in corporate environments where visibility was optional and influence rarely announced itself. I knew how to listen without nodding, how to observe without reacting, how to let other people underestimate me because it made their behavior more honest. Years ago, I had stepped back by choice, handed over titles, reduced my footprint, let my name fade from conversations that no longer required it. That quiet had felt earned. It had also taught me something important. Invisibility wasn't absence. It was camouflage. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. But first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. I hadn't come to the event seeking relevance or validation. I was there because my daughter-in-law had asked me to attend, because she said it would mean a lot to her to have family present. I believed her. Family still mattered to me in uncomplicated ways, even if corporate life had trained me to expect complications everywhere else. I dressed conservatively, deliberately avoiding anything that suggested authority or demanded explanation. A dark suit, a neutral tie, polished shoes that blended rather than announced. I knew the role I would be assigned the moment I walked in. Someone's father-in-law, someone peripheral, someone safe. I accepted that role easily, never imagining it would be weaponized against me within minutes. When she kissed my forehead, it felt sincere. There was no urgency in it, no tension, no theatricality. Just a brief, affectionate gesture that reminded me she had once been a younger woman who laughed easily at family dinners, who asked me for advice she didn't always take. I remember the angle of her face, the steadiness of her breath, the way she lingered half a second longer than necessary before stepping back. At the time, I interpreted it as warmth. Only later would I understand how precise it had been. She walked away calmly, merging into the crowd as if nothing significant had just occurred. I leaned against the glass table without thought, grounding myself in the cool surface, unaware that the room had already begun to turn. The shout fractured the atmosphere with surgical precision. "Don't touch the glass." It wasn't panic, it was protocol. Panic scattered. Protocol converged. I felt it immediately in the way people froze, the way security appeared from architectural blind spots I hadn't noticed, the way the music died as if someone had pulled a plug. My hand was still on the table when the first officer reached me. I lifted it slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I understood how moments like this escalated when movements were misread. I stepped back, palms open, posture cooperative. Still, I could feel the weight of attention settle on me, heavy and unmistakable. They didn't accuse me outright. They didn't need to. Accusation was inefficient. They asked questions instead, controlled, neutral, carefully sequenced. Had I been in the building earlier? Did I have clearance? Did I know the purpose of the display? Each answer I gave landed softly and went nowhere, absorbed into a process that was already moving ahead of me. When one of the technicians explained that the glass was treated with an invisible chemical layer designed to detect unauthorized contact, I felt a flicker of disbelief followed by something colder. I hadn't known. And yet, the system didn't care. It responded to residue, not intent. The crowd reacted in stages. First curiosity, then distance. People shifted subtly away from me, recalibrating their positions as if proximity alone could implicate them. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, glances thrown like punctuation marks in a story I hadn't agreed to star in. I searched the room for my daughter-in-law again, this time with intention. She was gone. That absence registered more sharply now, no longer dismissible as coincidence. I told myself not to overinterpret it. Panic made patterns where none existed. But I had spent too long in rooms like this to ignore timing entirely. When security asked me to step aside, they used the word temporarily, a linguistic cushion meant to soften inevitability. I followed them without protest, aware that compliance was not admission but refusal would be read as resistance. The room they led me to was small, bright, and deliberately uncomfortable, designed to discourage lingering without appearing punitive. They offered water. They asked me to wait. Radios murmured outside the door, voices clipped and efficient, exchanging information I couldn't hear. Time stretched, thinning into something elastic and unreliable. Sitting alone, I replayed the moment again, not obsessively, but analytically. The kiss, the angle, the proximity, her gloves. I hadn't noticed them at first because they hadn't seemed unusual. Formal events encouraged accessories that concealed as much as they adorned. But now the memory sharpened, details aligning with a clarity I hadn't wanted. She had leaned in close enough to obscure the line of sight, close enough to transfer something without detection, close enough to make it look like affection rather than intent. The realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with understanding, and that, somehow, hurt more. An investigator joined me eventually, his demeanor calm, his questions precise. He explained that the chemical residue detected on the glass matched a profile associated with restricted access earlier that day. When he said it, he watched my face closely, measuring reaction. I told him, again, that I hadn't been in the building before the event. He nodded, made a note, and said they would verify. Verification was not reassurance. It was delay. It meant I would remain suspended between narratives until one hardened enough to prevail. As the hours passed, the isolation deepened. I thought about how controlled environments created their own gravity, pulling conclusions inward until alternatives struggled to escape. I thought about family, about how loyalty was often tested not by grand gestures, but by quiet choices made under pressure. Somewhere in the building, I knew decisions were being weighed, about optics, about liability, about how much truth was worth exposing when discretion could be preserved instead. I also knew that whatever had begun with a gentle kiss was no longer just about security protocols. It was about how easily innocence could be engineered and how quickly trust could be repurposed into evidence. By the time they told me I would need to stay longer, that further review was required. I had already accepted a difficult truth. This wasn't an accident that would resolve itself with clarification. It was a setup that relied on plausibility, on my invisibility, on the assumption that no one would look too closely at a gesture everyone had seen and dismissed. Sitting there under fluorescent lights, I understood that the night would not end with explanations. It would end with consequences. And the first of them had already arrived, quietly, in the form of a realization I could no longer ignore. The most dangerous betrayals rarely looked like betrayal at all. "Sir," the technician said quietly, turning the tablet toward the investigator instead of me. "The scan indicates prior contact." The words were delivered without drama, which somehow made them heavier. Prior contact implied history, intent, repetition. It implied I hadn't just brushed against the glass absent-mindedly, that I'd been there before, earlier in the day, moving through restricted areas with purpose. I felt a tightening in my chest, not panic, but disbelief sharpened by experience. In my world, accusations rarely arrived as statements. They arrived as data. Numbers didn't shout. They suggested. And once a suggestion gained institutional backing, it stopped needing proof to feel real. The investigator didn't accuse me outright. He didn't need to. He asked me again where I'd been that morning, whether I'd visited the building before the event, whether anyone could confirm my whereabouts. I answered steadily, repeating what I'd already said, aware of how repetition sometimes sounded like rehearsal. I explained that I'd arrived directly for the reception, that I hadn't been inside earlier, that I didn't possess clearance of any kind. He nodded, making notes, his expression unchanged. That neutrality unsettled me more than suspicion would have. It meant the process was still open, and that openness left room for narratives to form without my input. They showed me the data next. Not in detail, not enough to interpret, but enough to understand the problem. The chemical layer on the glass reacted to specific compounds carried by authorized personnel, traces left behind by gloves, badges, controlled environments. The residue detected on the table matched a pattern recorded earlier that day in a restricted corridor. Someone had touched the glass who shouldn't have, and the system believed that someone was me. I listened carefully, absorbing each word, already recognizing the shape of the trap. Plausible deniability worked both ways. The more sophisticated the system, the harder it was to argue with its conclusions. Time became strange after that. Not slow, exactly, but layered. Every few minutes, someone stepped in to ask a question, confirm a detail, or relay information I wasn't allowed to hear. Doors opened and closed. Radios crackled. Somewhere nearby, the event continued, its controlled elegance now a distant echo. I sat alone between these interruptions, replaying the evening not emotionally, but mechanically. The kiss, the timing, the table, the gloves. Each element fit together with an efficiency that felt intentional. And the more I examined it, the clearer it became that this wasn't a spontaneous mistake. It was choreography. What unsettled me most wasn't the accusation. It was how reasonable it looked. I had been near the glass. I had touched it. I had no witnesses who could definitively place me elsewhere earlier that day. And I had a familial connection to someone who worked inside the building. That alone raised questions. In environments like this, coincidence was treated as a liability. Patterns mattered more than explanations. I knew how internal investigations worked. I'd overseen them once, long ago. They didn't look for villains. They looked for closure. And closure often came at the expense of nuance. When they finally mentioned detaining me temporarily, the word landed with bureaucratic gentleness. Temporary meant indefinite until resolved. It meant my name would be logged, my movements tracked, my access restricted. It meant the beginning of a record that didn't care whether it was deserved. I asked if I could contact my family. They said yes, later. I asked if my daughter-in-law had been questioned. The investigator paused, just long enough to confirm what I'd already suspected. She left the premises shortly after the incident, he said. We'll be speaking with her as well. The phrasing suggested equality, but the timing told a different story. Hours later, when she finally appeared, escorted into the interview area, her composure was impeccable. She looked concerned, appropriately shaken, exactly as someone innocent would under scrutiny. She met my eyes briefly and offered a small, reassuring smile, the kind meant to communicate solidarity. We'll fix this, she said softly, taking a seat across from me when allowed. Her voice was steady, her posture controlled. Too controlled. I noticed how carefully she placed her hands in her lap, how she avoided touching surfaces unnecessarily. The thoughts surfaced uninvited. She knew exactly what not to do. As the questioning continued, I began to notice inconsistencies. Not dramatic ones, but subtle deviations in her timeline, small omissions that required follow-up. She explained her departure as routine, her kiss as affectionate, her gloves as part of the dress code. Everything she said was true, or close enough to it to pass. That was the brilliance of it. Lies demanded maintenance. Partial truths sustained themselves. I watched the investigators respond to her with a different energy, protective, deferential. She was an employee. I was an outsider. That distinction mattered more than any bond of blood. The suspicion settled over me gradually, like a realization I didn't want to claim. I thought about the pressures she'd mentioned in passing over the past months, tight deadlines, internal audits, rumors of restructuring. I thought about how often corporate loyalty was tested not with threats, but with leverage disguised as opportunity. And I understood, with a clarity that felt both sharp and sad, that I hadn't been chosen at random. I had been chosen because I was safe to sacrifice. Older, peripheral, plausible. Someone whose removal wouldn't disrupt the system she was trying to survive. By the time they ended the session and told me I'd need to remain available for further review, my internal calculus had changed. This was no longer about clearing my name quickly or trusting the process to self-correct. It was about understanding the forces at play and deciding how much truth I was willing to expose to defend myself. I knew enough to recognize a near-perfect setup when I saw one. And I knew, just as surely, that unraveling it would require patience, precision, and a willingness to accept that the truth, when it emerged, would cost more than silence ever could. She sat across from me and said, I know this looks bad, but we'll fix it, with a calm that felt practiced rather than comforting. The words landed softly, arranged to soothe, but they didn't reach me the way she intended. I nodded because nodding kept the room quiet, and quiet kept the investigators listening. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the camera mounted in the corner, then back to me. It was subtle, barely a glance, but it carried intent. In that moment, I understood something irreversible was forming beneath the surface of this conversation, and that whatever came next would not be solved by reassurance or family ties alone. I had always believed loyalty showed itself under pressure, not comfort. Sitting there, I watched how carefully she modulated her concern, how she spoke in sentences that avoided corners where questions might hide. The investigator asked about timing. She answered with times rounded to the minute. He asked about the kiss. She described it as habitual, familial, harmless. No hesitation, no embellishment. I noticed how her hands stayed folded, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. Gloves were no longer present, of course, but the memory of them lingered between us like a prop removed too late from a stage. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Then I told myself conclusions didn't jump. They accumulated. A text buzzed on the investigator's phone, breaking the rhythm of the room. He glanced down, nodded once, and asked her to clarify her route after she left the reception. She described the exit calmly, mentioning a corridor that intersected with service elevators. The investigator asked her to repeat that last part. She did, word for word. Precision could be admirable, but it could also be rehearsed. I thought of the pressure she'd hinted at over the past months. Long nights, closed-door meetings, a culture that rewarded compliance disguised as opportunity. I wondered who had taught her which details to emphasize and which to leave untouched. 2 hours later, they separated us. The phrase used was to streamline review, but the effect was isolation. I sat alone again, listening to the building breathe, vents whispering, distant footsteps, the muted click of keyboards beyond the door. Time markers appeared in my mind uninvited. Earlier that day, before the event, minutes after the kiss, now, hours later. Each point was a pin holding a larger pattern in place. A guard brought water. A knock came and went. A legal liaison introduced herself and explained my options with careful neutrality. I heard the words and cataloged them without deciding anything yet. When they brought me back in, the tone had shifted. The investigator spoke more slowly, as if pace itself could coax the truth to the surface. He mentioned internal sabotage concerns explicitly now. Data siphoned, access logs altered, a breach that required a plausible culprit. He didn't accuse me, but the implication sat plainly on the table between us. I asked whether indirect transfer of residue was possible. He paused, then said yes, theoretically, under controlled conditions. The pause mattered. It meant the door was open, but only a crack. He asked why I brought it up. I said because theory was often where truth hid when certainty failed. A door opened briefly and closed again. Voices murmured beyond it. The investigator returned with a tablet and showed me still frames from the footage. The kiss slowed. The angle isolated. The crowd blurring around us while the two of us remained sharp. I watched without expression, letting the images speak. There was a moment, half a second, where her shoulder blocked the line of sight to the table completely. The investigator asked what I noticed. I said that the camera noticed intention even when people didn't. He nodded, as if filing that away for later. I sensed then that escalation didn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looked like curiosity refusing to die. She was interviewed again. I wasn't present, but I could imagine the cadence. Concern measured, cooperation offered, boundaries respected. When she returned, she looked tired now, the first crack in her composure. She met my eyes again, and for a brief moment the reassurance was gone. Something else sat there. Fear, perhaps, or calculation adjusting to new variables. She repeated that we would fix this. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish her with silence, but because words had become instruments here, and I didn't want to play the wrong one at the wrong time. By late evening, a senior counsel arrived, the kind whose presence signaled stakes beyond protocol. He asked questions that cut across departments, across narratives, across the comfort of plausible explanations. He asked about pressure, about leverage, about who benefited if the breach was attributed quickly and cleanly. The room grew smaller as those questions landed. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law deferred to procedure in her answers, how rarely she spoke from personal knowledge. I noticed, too, how often her gaze slid away when the word coercion appeared, even hypothetically. Patterns didn't accuse. They suggested. A knock interrupted us again. An assistant delivered a sealed envelope and left. The counsel skimmed its contents, then looked up with a careful neutrality that told me nothing and everything. He said the board wanted resolution before morning. He said reputational risk was mounting. He said there were ways to contain damage if cooperation was complete. Cooperation. The word was a lever disguised as an invitation. I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders and understood that escalation had reached a threshold. Someone would pay for closure. The only question was who. I asked for a full forensic review of the video angles, not just the primary camera. The counsel hesitated, then agreed. It would take time, he said. Time we didn't have. I said time was cheaper than a lie. The room went quiet again. In that quiet, I felt the consequence forming, slow, inevitable. If the truth emerged, it would expose not just a setup, but the pressure behind it. If it didn't, I would carry a mark that never fully washed off. I realized then that escalation wasn't just the system tightening around me. It was me deciding how much of the system I was willing to let remain hidden to protect someone who had decided I was expendable. The problem, the investigator said, folding his hands as if posture alone could stabilize the room, is that if this was intentional, it was almost perfect. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the table between us, at the tablet resting there with its paused frame of the kiss frozen mid-gesture. Almost perfect meant it could pass scrutiny. It meant it could survive first questions, even second ones. It meant that without patience, and without someone insisting on it, the simplest explanation would win. I felt the weight of that assessment settle into my chest, not as fear, but as resolve. Because when something was almost perfect, the flaw that proved it wasn't tended to be small, overlooked, and devastating once seen. By morning, the building felt different. Quieter. The gala had ended hours earlier, its remnants reduced to catering carts and the faint smell of cleaning solution. In its place, the machinery of containment hummed. Offices that had buzzed with congratulatory emails now exchanged legal holds. Hallways emptied. Access tightened. I was moved to a more formal interview room, one that suggested seriousness without accusation, neutral colors, soft lighting, a glass wall that let observers see without being seen. The fallout had begun, and it wasn't loud. It was administrative. That made it more dangerous. They walked me through a reconstruction, step by step. The chemical layer on the glass reacted to contact, but it also responded to transfer. Oils, compounds, residue moved indirectly through touch. The earlier breach had left a signature. That signature now appeared on the glass. I had touched the glass. The system connected the dots. It didn't need motive. It needed continuity. I listened as they explained it, nodding where appropriate, noting how convincingly the narrative assembled itself. This was how good setups worked. They borrowed the language of reason. They didn't scream innocence or guilt. They whispered probability. The legal liaison arrived with careful concern and fewer options than her tone suggested. She spoke about cooperation, about minimizing exposure, about how accepting procedural fault could be reframed as misunderstanding rather than malice. I asked whether that would close the espionage inquiry. She hesitated, then said it would likely redirect it. Redirect meant replace. It meant a clean line drawn through a complicated truth. I thought about how often organizations preferred a single accountable figure to a systemic failure. I thought about how often families did the same thing. The thought wasn't bitter. It was clarifying. My daughter-in-law was interviewed again, and this time I was allowed to observe through the glass. She looked smaller now, fatigue finally eroding the composure she'd worn like armor. Still, her answers remained controlled. She spoke of pressure in abstract terms, deadlines, expectations, the weight of responsibility. She didn't name names. She didn't accuse. She framed everything as diligence misunderstood. Watching her, I felt the uncomfortable coexistence of two truths. She was under pressure, and she had chosen me as the release valve. Understanding that didn't absolve her. It contextualized her choice, which somehow made it harder to accept. Midday brought a complication. An internal memo surfaced. Redacted, but unmistakably urgent, requesting expedited resolution due to investor sensitivity. The investigator shared it with me without commentary. The implication was clear. Time had become a liability. I felt the walls narrow, the room's neutrality beginning to lean. In such moments, systems didn't bend toward truth. They bent toward stability. I asked again for the expanded video analysis, all angles, all timestamps. The investigator said it was underway, but slow. I said slow was fine. He said slow was risky. I said risk depended on what you were protecting. The media containment team made their presence known without entering the room. A phone call was taken just outside the glass. Voices lowered. Words like narrative and exposure drifted in fragments. I realized then that fallout wasn't just about me. It was about the building, the brand, the promise of security they sold. A breach without a culprit threatened confidence. A culprit without a scandal restored it. I understood the calculus. I also understood where that left me if patience failed. When they brought my daughter-in-law back in to sit across from me, the air changed again. She looked at me with something that might have been apology, might have been calculation recalibrating under stress. She said she was sorry this was happening. She said she never meant for it to go this far. I asked her what far was. She didn't answer. Silence stretched, heavy and revealing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I asked whether anyone had told her she could lose everything if the breach wasn't attributed quickly. Her eyes flicked toward the door. That was answer enough. Later, the investigator returned with preliminary findings. Indirect transfer was possible, he confirmed. The sequence of contact could be consistent with distraction. The kiss, the blocked sight line, the timing, it all fit. But fit wasn't proof. Proof required a detail that refused to align, a small inconsistency that unraveled the whole. He asked me what I thought that detail might be. I said intent left traces where systems didn't look, angles, pauses, choices made when no one was watching. He nodded, as if we were finally speaking the same language. The fallout intensified as evening approached. Access badges deactivated. Departments quarantined. A senior executive requested a private briefing with me. He spoke carefully, emphasizing appreciation for my cooperation, hinting at outcomes that would preserve dignity. Dignity, I noted, was often offered when exoneration wasn't. I told him I wasn't interested in dignity at the expense of truth. He smiled thinly and said truth was complicated. I said complication didn't make it optional. The smile faded. I asked for one thing, and one thing only. The full resolution footage from the camera mounted above the table, uncompressed, with angle metadata intact. Not the edited clips, not the highlights. The raw feed. The executive hesitated, then agreed, warning that it might not change the outcome. I said outcomes didn't change truth. They only changed who lived with it. He left without responding. Night fell again, and with it came a strange calm. The building's hum softened. The rush slowed. I sat alone and considered what I would do if the truth emerged fully. Whether I would expose the pressure behind the setup. Whether I would protect my family by absorbing the blow. The questions didn't feel hypothetical anymore. They felt imminent. I realized then that fallout wasn't just the system reacting to a breach. It was me approaching a line I hadn't known existed. Between preserving a relationship built on affection and insisting on accountability when affection had been used as a tool. When the technician finally returned with the footage cued, I leaned forward, heart steady, mind clear. The setup had become believable. That was its strength. Now it needed to be undone by something just as quiet. I didn't know yet what that something was. I only knew that when it appeared, it would force a choice, not just for the investigators, but for me. And whatever I chose would not be reversible. Pause it there, the analyst said, his finger hovering over the tablet as the footage froze mid-motion. The room went still in a way I'd come to recognize, attention narrowing, assumptions holding their breath. On the screen, the moment everyone thought they understood was suspended in an unflattering clarity. my daughter-in-law leaning in, her face close to mine, the crowd blurred into soft shapes behind us. The kiss, slowed to a crawl, no longer looked affectionate. It looked precise. Even before anyone spoke again, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. This wasn't about whether something had happened. It was about whether anyone was willing to look closely enough to admit how it happened. The analyst zoomed in, adjusting contrast and angle metadata, narrating his movements without commentary. He wasn't selling a theory. He was letting the image speak. The camera above the table had captured the kiss from a perspective none of us had considered. Too high to register emotion, too distant to care about intent, but perfectly positioned to record geometry. The line of sight mattered. Her shoulder obscured the table entirely for a fraction of a second, a deliberate occlusion that turned intimacy into cover. I felt my pulse remain steady, a strange calm replacing the tension that had lived in my chest for hours. This was the flaw in the almost perfect setup. Small, overlooked, devastating. "Run it again," the investigator said, his voice lower now, less procedural. The footage replayed, and this time everyone leaned forward. The analyst marked timestamps, tracing the exact window where the residue could have transferred indirectly. He overlaid the chemical response data with the video feed, aligning cause and effect like transparent sheets sliding into place. When the overlay settled, the conclusion was unavoidable. The residue didn't come from my hand to the glass. It came from her glove to me, and from me to the glass. The system had been right about chemistry and wrong about agency. That distinction mattered. It always did. No one spoke for a long moment. In that silence, I thought about how many investigations ended without this pause, without someone insisting on slowing down. I thought about how easily the narrative would have closed if the room had chosen speed over scrutiny. The analyst finally looked up, meeting the investigator's eyes. "She never touched the glass," he said simply. "Not directly. The transfer was staged." Staged. The word carried intent without embellishment. It didn't accuse her of malice. It accused her of planning. They brought her in then. Not dramatically, not escorted by force, but with the careful gravity reserved for moments when denial had lost its usefulness. She sat across from me again, but the dynamic had shifted. The practiced calm was gone, replaced by a tension that pulled her shoulders inward. The investigator explained the findings without flourish, laying out the sequence as if it were a map that could no longer be folded away. When he finished, he asked her one question and waited. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me instead, and in her eyes I saw what I hadn't before. Not calculation, not defiance, but exhaustion. She spoke slowly, choosing words as if each one cost her something. She admitted the pressure first, not as an excuse, but as context. She described meetings that ended without notes, suggestions framed as expectations, consequences implied but never stated outright. She spoke about a breach that couldn't be traced cleanly and a need for a resolution that wouldn't ripple outward. She said they'd told her the transfer would be harmless, that it would look like a misunderstanding, that I'd be questioned and released once the system corrected itself. She didn't say who they were, but she didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood how power spoke when it didn't want to be quoted. When she finally said my name, it sounded different than before. She said she chose me because I was safe. Not safe in the way love protected you, but safe in the way systems absorbed you. I was older, peripheral, credible enough to satisfy procedure, and distant enough to limit fallout. She said she never thought it would go this far. I believed her. That belief didn't comfort me. It clarified the depth of the betrayal. Being chosen because you are safe to sacrifice changes the meaning of every memory that came before it. The investigator asked why she hadn't refused. She swallowed and looked down at her hands. She spoke about leverage, not dramatic threats, but quiet ones. A file that could be reopened. A mistake that could be reinterpreted. A spouse whose career depended on staying in favor. Family, she said, was the only thing they hadn't threatened directly. I felt the room lean towards sympathy then, the way rooms often do when coercion enters the story. I didn't object to that. Understanding pressure mattered. It just didn't absolve choice. The counsel asked me how I wanted to proceed. The question landed heavier than any accusation had. I thought about the ease of retaliation, how clean it would feel to let consequences fall hard and publicly. I thought about the building, the brand, the machinery already moving to redirect blame upward now that the evidence demanded it. And I thought about the kiss, how it had felt, how it had been used, how it had nearly worked. The truth had emerged not because the system wanted it to, but because someone had insisted on looking closely enough to see the angle. I asked for charges to be redirected toward the actual breach and those who orchestrated the cover. The counsel nodded, already calculating next steps. I didn't ask for her protection. I didn't ask for her punishment. I asked only that the record be accurate and complete. Accuracy, I'd learned, was its own boundary. It prevented people from rewriting you into something convenient later. The room accepted that condition without argument, relieved, I suspect, to have a path forward that didn't require spectacle. When the meeting ended, she stood as if to say something else, then stopped. Words weren't going to bridge what had opened between us. I watched her leave with a steadiness that surprised me, grief present but contained. The revelation had done its work. It had saved me, yes, but it had also stripped the moment of any remaining innocence. As the doors closed and the building's hum resumed, I understood that the truth rarely restored what it exposed. It clarified what remained worth keeping. I told them I wouldn't press charges, but I wouldn't protect her either. The sentence felt clean when I said it. Not sharp, not dramatic. It surprised a few people in the room, I could tell. They had expected a demand, a negotiation, maybe even a show of mercy framed as magnanimity. What they got instead was a boundary stated without decoration. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't interested in absolution. I was interested in accuracy, and accuracy required that consequences land where they belonged, without my hand cushioning the fall. I had learned long ago that boundaries only worked when they were simple enough to remember and firm enough to withstand disappointment. In the days that followed, the machinery moved quickly once it had a direction it could justify. The internal investigation widened, names rose, and then disappeared from email chains, and access that had once felt permanent was revoked with a few quiet keystrokes. I was informed, politely and sparingly, of progress I hadn't asked for. I didn't attend briefings. I didn't offer guidance. I had stepped far enough back to let the system do what it did best once it was forced to face itself. People assumed that was restraint. In truth, it was preservation. I wasn't willing to spend more of myself propping up a structure that had found it acceptable to sacrifice me for speed. She reached out once, a week later, with a message that took a long time to arrive and longer to read. It wasn't an apology in the way people expect apologies to look. It was careful, restrained, aware of the limits now in place. She wrote about fear, about pressure, about how small the decision had felt in the moment compared to how large it had become. She didn't ask me to intervene. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She asked only whether we could talk someday, when things were quieter. I read the message twice and then put the phone down. Quiet, I knew, wouldn't change what had already been clarified. My son called that evening, his voice tight with the strain of carrying two loyalties at once. He asked how I was holding up, asked whether there was anything he could do. I told him the truth. That I was steady, and that steadiness was the result of a decision, not the absence of pain. He asked what would happen next. I told him what I could without narrating someone else's consequences. I didn't speak badly of her. I didn't soften what had happened either. I said that trust, once repurposed as a tool, didn't return to its original shape. It had to be rebuilt, if it was rebuilt at all. The silence on the line after that felt heavy, but not hostile. It felt honest. At home, the ordinary rhythms returned slowly, as if unsure they were welcome. Morning light through the kitchen window, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet satisfaction of finishing a task without interruption. I noticed how much calmer my body felt now that the waiting was over. Suspense had a way of disguising itself as resilience until it lifted and you realized how tightly you'd been holding yourself together. I slept better. I thought more clearly. The absence of urgency was its own relief, even as the emotional cost made itself known in small, unexpected moments. When I thought about the kiss now, it no longer carried shock. It carried information. I understood how easily tenderness could be choreographed, how quickly familiarity could be mistaken for safety. That understanding didn't turn me cynical. It made me precise. I began to see other moments in my life through the same lens. Not to discredit them, but to recognize where I had filled in gaps with generosity that hadn't been earned. Precision, I learned, was not the enemy of kindness. It was its guardrail. Weeks later, I attended a small family gathering, the first since everything had come to light. She was there, quieter than before, careful in a way that suggested she understood the new geometry of the room. We exchanged greetings that were polite and restrained, neither warm nor cold. There was no confrontation. There didn't need to be. Boundaries, when held consistently, communicated themselves without explanation. I noticed how she avoided physical proximity, how she chose seats that kept space between us. I didn't interpret that as guilt or shame. I interpreted it as acknowledgement. That mattered more to me than apologies would have. Someone asked me privately whether I felt vindicated. The question surprised me with how little it applied. Vindication suggested a contest, a winner, a sense of triumph. I hadn't won anything. I had clarified something. There was a difference. Clarification didn't bring applause or relief in the way vindication promised. It brought alignment. My actions now matched my values without requiring justification. That alignment was quiet, and it was enough. I thought often about how close the setup had come to working. How a fraction of a second, a single angle, a willingness to slow down had separated me from a record that would have followed me indefinitely. The realization didn't make me fearful. It made me grateful for patience, my own, and that of one analyst who had insisted on precision over convenience. Systems failed when people rushed them. They corrected when someone refused to. The final boundary I set wasn't legal or professional. It was relational. I decided I would no longer lend my steadiness to situations that treated it as expendable. I would no longer absorb risk quietly to keep other people comfortable. That didn't mean withdrawing love. It meant redefining access. Love could remain, but proximity would be earned. Trust would be rebuilt with transparency, not assumed on the strength of shared history. That boundary didn't punish anyone. It protected me. On a quiet evening not long after, I stood by a window and watched the street settle into night. Cars passed. Lights flickered on and off. Life continued, indifferent to the weight we assigned to certain days. I felt older then, not in the way people fear, but in the way that comes from having survived something without becoming smaller. I hadn't needed to shout. I hadn't needed to expose anyone publicly. I had needed only to insist on accuracy and to accept what accuracy revealed. If you're listening to this and thinking about a moment when trust was tested under pressure, I hope you hear this part clearly. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of clarity. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is refuse to confuse tenderness with permission. I didn't forgive what was done to me. I didn't need to. I chose something harder and more enduring. I chose to keep my dignity intact, even when affection tried to borrow it without asking.